Good evening, everyone. It's so exciting. I know. Everybody is completely jazzed tonight. Thank you very much for joining us, those of you who are here in person, and we also have quite a few people tuning in by Zoom. I'm Kate Markert. I'm Executive Director here at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens in Washington, D.C., which I now have to say because we have people on Zoom from all over the place, so it's great. My pronouns are she and her. And I think you know as I begin, I always like to gratefully acknowledge the Nacotchtank, also documented as the Anacostan, the Piscataway, and the Pamunkey. And those, of course, are the native peoples on whose lands Hillwood stands, and as well as the diverse and vibrant native communities that make their homes near us today. We are so pleased to have audiences joining us for tonight's program, both here in the theater and by Zoom. Now, you know, those of you who are here, you know what I'm going to say next, right? Turn off your phones, anything that's going to chirp or squeal or, you know, make crazy noises. So make sure your devices are silenced. And then for those of you at home, I know you're at home because you do not like to put on shoes. So do not worry. Your phones are off, your cameras are off. We can't hear whatever it is you're saying there. We can't hear. But you can submit questions via the Q&A module on the Zoom menu whenever they cross your mind. And we will get to as many questions, and I know from this audience that there will be many questions at the end. We'll be getting as many of them as we can from both locations. And I don't know, Katie, do you want people to wait for a microphone afterwards? I don't know. She's not hearing me. But we usually do that because otherwise the people on Zoom can't hear you. So please wait for the microphone to come around. It is always bittersweet to get to the end of our annual Great Homes and Gardens lecture series. It's hard to believe that it's already flown by. It has really been wonderful to gather each week and hear from incredible experts. And I know the series is going to conclude on a very high note tonight. We're going to hear from Victoria Kastner about Julia Morgan. But it will not be long before we are able to gather again, as in next Wednesday. We're going to have an exciting lecture about black and white film project and the Patterson portrait. If you've seen that really beautiful portrait that's in the mansion. So that's on Wednesday, March 6th. And then later in the month, we have a two-part lecture series related to the current exhibition, which I hope you've had a chance to see, Marjorie Merriweather Post's Paris. So beautiful. It's in the Dacha. See it many, many times. Those lectures are going to be on March 14th and then again on the 27th. So if you aren't already a member, I encourage you to join today. You can learn a lot more about all of Hillwood's programming, and we have a lot of programming all throughout the year. But it's on our website, hillwoodmuseum.org. So tonight we hear from Victoria Kastner, who will share stories about the life and legacy of the trailblazing architect Julia Morgan. There will be a book signing afterwards, right outside, and right after the lecture. And as you may know, I hope some of you have already bought your copies upstairs in the museum shop. Victoria Kastner was the official historian for Hearst Castle for nearly 3 decades. She started when she was 12. In addition to her new biography about this very talented architect, she has also written 3 volumes chronicling its fascinating history. Hearst Castle, the biography of a country house, Hearst San Simeon, the gardens and the land, and Hearst Ranch, family, land, and legacy. She also has published works on the Beverly Hills Hotel. Yeah, I want to read that one too. and Bernard Maybeck's Palace of Fine Arts, and the novels of Charles Dickens. Now please join me in welcoming Victoria Kastner to the podium.
Hello, everyone. What a pleasure it is to be here and to conclude this distinguished series. I did think when you were kind enough to first invite me, now, what are the areas of confluence between Julia Morgan and Marjorie Merriweather Post? And at first, it did seem to me that there probably were more areas of commonality between Marjorie Merriweather Post and Julia Morgan's longest and most extravagant client, William Randolph Hearst, and we'll talk more about that. But when I started thinking about it, they both love France, Julia and Marjorie. They were both in France for the first time at the same time. Marjorie's first trip in 1900 was while Julia was studying in Paris at the Ecole des Beaux-Arts. They felt differently about fashion, though, because I got to see the fabulous exhibit in the DACA, and one of the gorgeous gowns is from Au Bon Marché, really one of the first and most elegant of Paris department stores. And when Julia went there, she wrote to her cousins. Her second cousin, Lucy, married a distinguished architect, Pierre Lebrun, whose MetLife Tower building still stands on Madison Avenue. And Pierre Lebrun was a mentor. Anyway, she said to Lucy, "I wish you could come with me. Unfortunately, I have to get clothes. I went to Au Bon Marché for the first and last time." So fashion, you got to say, for sure, they diverge. But these are two powerful women who loved art, who loved architecture, who really cared about integrating the interior and the exterior in all their projects, who treated their staff members with exceptional generosity, and of course, who were very, very successful entrepreneurs who believed in themselves and had a distinct vision. So those are some of the confluences I came up with. Though Julia Morgan never married, she loved children. Long rumor that she may have been a lesbian. I have found no sign of that. When I share with you how busy her life was and how difficult. I did study her during my entire career, but it was only in 2018 that I began to write this book and realize that her health was worse, her family responsibilities were heavier than I had ever imagined, and her real love affair was with architecture. These are her nephew and niece. She was very close to them and close to the children of her staff, but she never had a long-term roommate, a permanent traveling companion, a romantic relationship with anyone except architecture. Though she also, the myth is, burned her papers, and I'm glad to tell you that isn't true either. Her archives are at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo's libraries, special collections, and my research assistant and I are completing, transcribing the letters to her and from her, diaries, 5 diaries included, and they total 800,000 words. And that project we are finalizing, and then we're giving those word searchable transcriptions to Cal Poly. It's going to take us a couple of years to finish it off, but then people can study Julia Morgan from anywhere in the world. And she is so worth it because she had such a remarkable trailblazing career. I know we associate her with San Simeon, and that's reasonable since she and William Randolph first worked on this project together for 28 years, 1919 to 1947. When she started it, she couldn't vote in a presidential election, and yet it was on her job list of her projects number 503. And you'd think there wouldn't have been a 504. But she actually designed 700 buildings, and much of her best work was done while San Simeon was underway. So this is the first book to tell the story, not just of her buildings, but of her life, her private life. I mean, had the pleasure of speaking with some of you this, at the reception just now, some of you who mentioned the Berkeley Women's City Club and as a place you stayed or are fond of, and it was one of the many dozens of women's clubs that Julia designed. This is the swimming pool that's on the cover. And she designed almost 3 dozen swimming pools in her career. Since she was such a visual architect, I not only quoted, from letters and drawings and things, but we felt we had to show her story visually, and so I was very fortunate to collaborate with a photographer. His name is Alexander Vertikoff, and he specializes in architecture photography. And he's so good, he can make a two-dimensional image look three-dimensional. And this is Julia Morgan's Chapel of the Chimes, which is a columbarium in North Oakland, a mausoleum for funerary urns. But it just gives you a sense of the beauty of her work. So who was Julia Morgan? I think if you asked her, she might say that she was a Californian, because she was a native Californian. She was very proud of that. She was the second of 5 children and the eldest girl. And she was born in San Francisco on the 20th of January of 1872, and moved to Oakland when she was 2 years old, and lived in the Bay Area all of her life. She was an intense child always, and got, I think, a lot of her intensity from her mother, who was a very strong personality. Eliza Parmalee was from Brooklyn Heights, had grown up in great wealth. Eliza's father, Albert Parmalee, was a cotton broker before and after the Civil War. And the men, there were three boys and 2 girls among the children, and the men, including Julia's father and her brothers, were not particularly strong and dynamic. It was the women who were that, and Julia's younger sister, Emma, who was an attorney, and her mother, Eliza. When Eliza wrote to Julia, who was on a school event at UC Berkeley, she wrote to her on a letterhead that said at the top, "Quincit vi patitur," which means he conquers who suffers. And she said, "I hope you're having a good time. Let a spirit of duty animate you. Should you be inclined to droop." Julia Morgan was very rarely inclined to droop. But anyway, the energy definitely comes from Eliza. The imagination, the kind of sense of nothing being impossible, that came from her father, Charles Bill Morgan, who was also from Brooklyn Heights, had a lot of grand ideas. He wanted to be a sugar broker in Hawaii. He wanted to do a lot of things. But in fact, his entrepreneurial skills did not match his entrepreneurial ambitions. And Julia's younger sister, Emma's son, Morgan North, said of his grandfather, "He was in sugar, farm machinery, nails, balloons, voting machines. Whatever didn't work, he was in." And a lot of the money that funded the Morgan family on the West Coast was provided by the Parmalees on the East Coast. And Julia was often on the East Coast. As a matter of fact, she spent one whole year of her childhood in Brooklyn Heights on Remsen Street. She was christened at the great Trinity Church by Richard Upjohn in Brooklyn Heights. And of course, Brooklyn Heights was the most elegant suburb of New York. 63 Remsen Street, where the family's 5-story brownstone was, has been torn down. It's now a hotel. But this is very near on the same street, and this is a back window. So it gives you a sense of the kind of elegance. And she grew up loving architecture, partly, as I said, she had this architect, the husband of her second cousin. Also, her mother, Sarah, her grandmother, Eliza's mother, Sarah Woodland Parmalee, had lived in a great estate in Kent County, Maryland. It still exists, and it's on the National Register. It's called Woodland Hall. But when Sarah was only 12 years old, her mother died, and her father remarried. And the stepmother managed to get Woodland Hall sold to and given to another branch of the family. And so Sarah, who came after Albert Parmalee, Julia's grandfather, the cotton broker. After he died, Sarah, her grandmother, came out to California and lived with the family for 10 years. So Julia grew up hearing stories about Woodland Hall, this great estate that she never got to see. But she carried a photograph of it in her personal possessions for her entire life. So this is someone who made grand estates for other people. And she went to public schools, Oakland High, which was a very fine school, and this is where the Morgan family lived, in an elegant Victorian that was funded by the Parmalee money. Julia Morgan moved into this house in 1885 when she was 13, and she lived there for the next 40 years until 1925 when she moved to San Francisco. So she was, even though she spent a lot of time on the train, crossing the country, a lot of time on the East Coast, but she definitely was a native Californian. And they lived in elegance, with beautiful art. The San Francisco Examiner, the future newspaper of William Randolph Hearst, Julia didn't know him then, but he was the editor in 1892 when they did this story about the redwood fireplace in the living room of Charles Morgan's house. So this was elegant enough to be documented with this beautiful archway, which was redwood and then gilded. The red portieres, I loved all the portieres I saw in the house at Hillwood, and Ingleside seating, on both sides. So she grew up around beauty and elegance, and because we were able to identify this newspaper article, then we were able to identify this photograph, which is Julia's mother, Eliza, in that living room, about 1898. And you can see the built-in bookcases, the lovely folio volumes. Eliza's working on quilting. There's a bamboo stand from the aesthetic movement. There's the requisite house plant with in the brass basin. There are object art all over the place, including photographs and vases of flowers on the floor. So she certainly grew up in elegance, and she went to the University of California, and this is what it looked like when she enrolled in 1890, which was 4 buildings in a big field. And she wanted to study architecture, but they didn't have an architecture program when she enrolled, so Julia Morgan entered the civil engineering program and graduated with a degree in civil engineering in 1894. 2 other women had studied civil engineering, but they never did anything with it. So she was a pioneer in that sense. But one of the most important times of her life came right after she graduated. In 1895, when this man arrived, Bernard Maybeck, an architect from New York. He grew up a family of furniture makers in Greenwich Village. And he came to California after working in Florida and in Kansas City, and especially after going to school in Paris at the Ecole des Beaux-Arts, the School of Fine Arts, which had been founded in 1648, basically as a feeder school for the future artisans of Versailles. Founded in 1648 and had never admitted a woman into the program. But Maybeck, who came to teach descriptive geometry, he met Julia even though she'd already graduated. And he encouraged her and thought that she had the ability to succeed at the school, and he had stayed in touch, so he knew the rumor that they were going to be admitting women to the painting and sculpture divisions of the Ecole. Women had been lobbying for this for decades. He was an eccentric person in the sense of his clothing being highly colorful. Often his waistband ended just at the bottom of his armpits, and he wore unusual clothing and ate strange food and was often laughed at by his colleagues who called him a freak. But he was a visionary, and he was also an extremely effective convincer in helping other people, as he put it, dream big. And he met Phoebe Apperson Hearst, who was William Randolph Hearst's mother, just about 1895. Phoebe Hearst had been born in Franklin County, Missouri. Marjorie Merriweather Post is a Midwesterner. Well, Phoebe was born on the Merrimack River Valley, which she later called a miserable country. And it was said of her that she held a butter churn in her right hand and a book in her left. She taught herself to speak French. She became a school teacher. And when she was 19, she married a 41-year-old miner. He'd also grown up in Franklin County on the Merrimack River, but he'd left for the gold fields when Phoebe was in grammar school. His name was George Hurst, and he was a bluff, he was a lead miner, and he was a bluff kind of country bonanza king who left for California. Gold was discovered in 1848. He left in 1850 and then didn't dare come back until he was successful, which took 12 hard years. But in 1862, he was part of the investors who found the richest vein of silver in North America, which was the Comstock lode. And with that, and with the news that his mother was soon to be dying, he returned to Missouri, and he met Phoebe Hearst. He's 41. She's this lovely young woman. They married in 1862. And she was always writing to him, reminding him to check his beard for tobacco juice and had he changed his shirt and that sort of thing. He he used to tiptoe through Phoebe's tea parties with holding his hobnail boots, or he would host Sam Clemens, Mark Twain, at the bottom of the table at Phoebe's elegant dinner parties, and the two of them would have hog and hominy, as they put it, while everybody else was dining off a French fare. So he never lost that kind of prairie, Midwesternness. And he became a senator. but as I say, very much with the rough edges unsanded. He stood up. He became a senator. He was appointed in 1887. Then he was elected in 1888. He stood up on the floor of the Senate in this city and said, "There are those that say I spell bird with a U. Well, if B-U-R-D doesn't spell bird, I'd like to know what the hell it does spell." So when he died, Phoebe had become, the great hostess of Washington, but she also became. They had just the one child, William Randolph Hearst. He was born in 1863, soon after they arrived in San Francisco. She also became the sole inheritor of an extraordinary fortune. In 1891, she inherited George's $20 million, which in 1891 was equivalent to more than $500 million in today's values. And their son, William Randolph Hearst, at 28, did not inherit because both mother and father knew he was an absolute spendthrift. So, and Phoebe was as well. But anyway, he really was kind of on a leash to her for the next couple of decades. But W.R. got his love of art and culture from his mother. And Phoebe took him to Europe the first time when he was 10. They stayed a year and a half. She wrote home to George in the mining fields. Willie wants to buy everything he sees. And George continued to invest, and that included Anaconda Copper, Homestake Gold. He really did become one of the most successful of the Bonanza Kings. So he died in 1891. Phoebe was in her 40s. W.R. was 28. He'd already started his first newspaper, a money-losing headache that his dad had won in a poker game, called the San Francisco Examiner. That was in 1887 when he was 24. And W.R. eventually parlayed that into 28 newspapers, 14 magazines, 2 film companies, 8 radio stations, and a news service. So, he did become a media mogul. But when George died, Phoebe said she wanted to build a memorial to him on the University of California campus. And she wanted to build a mining building there, which would be like studying software technology today. It was the high-tech field in 1891. So she approached the university in 1895, and they said, well, let's get the only architect on campus, and that happened to be Bernard Maybeck. So he said, yes, Mrs. Hurst, we could build that mining building, but don't you think it would be a better idea if we designed a worldwide architecture competition to design the entire campus, and then we can figure out where to put the mining building? And she said yes, wrote literally a blank check for what was the first juried international architecture competition in the world. And Maybeck ran it. And since he ran it, he didn't design many buildings at the university, but he did design this structure for Phoebe. This was her, if you will, her Adirondacks getaway. Though it looks like it came off the Rhine River, right? This is Wyntoon, Wyntoon, this 7-story stone and slate structure that just looks like it's growing out of the forest. And he designed this for her in 1901 on the Oregon border of California. It was named after the native people of the area, which were the Wyntoon tribe. So Maybeck convinced Phoebe to dream big. He convinced Julia to dream big and to travel to Paris and to apply for this school of architecture. She arrived in 1896. Women were admitted in 1897 to the painting and sculpture department. This is the salle des études, where Julia was allowed to sit in on the classes. When the women were admitted to those departments, the men were so outraged that they rioted. They chased the women through the streets. This was a place that had been, since the middle of the 17th century, based on all of these hazing and strongly male traditions. Julia wrote to Pierre Lebrun and Lucy and sent this little diagram. I'm trying to find that. Well, anyway, I'll just say, because I'm not doing so well with the laser pointer. You see it says court on the right, and then it says men, M-E-N, on the left, that long hall. Then at the top it says empty, and then it says Budd, B-U-D-D. That was the name of a young woman who studied but never entered the school, Catherine Budd. And then it says me. And then at the top it says stores, like supplies. So Julia says to the Lebruns, one of the men in this atelier where she's practicing to take the examinations to enter the Ecole, she says, one of the men is very gentlemanly, but the others could have been exchanged with no difficulty. She was hazed. There is no doubt about it. They said that she was pushed off benches. She had water poured over her head. She was impervious to that sort of thing. She took the examination, and it was arduous. She didn't succeed the first time. Hardly anybody ever did. But she did very well. She scored 42nd out of about 400 candidates. She loved Paris. And as I said, she was there from 1896 to the start of 1902. Her favorite place was Notre Dame. She hated to have her photograph taken, but she did pose here for it. And she said the thing she loved to do the most was go up to the top of the towers and look down on these, what she called half-fiend, half-monster gargoyles, and picture the city as they had seen it through the centuries as it grew and grew. So she did the practicing that you had to do to take these examinations. They'd lock you in a room for 12 hours and give you an assignment. Design a theater in a palace or design a war memorial. You turned in a sketch like this at the end of the 12 hours. And this was the way that you advanced through the program as well as took the entry exams. Then you took the next 6 weeks, and during that time, you did elaborate drawings in plan, section, and elevation that you turned in, and if in any way they diverged from that sketch that you no longer had, you were disqualified from the competition. So that it was arduous. And the second time she took the exam, her score was worse. And she was so ashamed, and she asked the head of the architecture atelier, his name was Marcel de Moclos, she said, well, what was wrong? And he got this funny look on his face, and he said, the score. The judges had artificially lowered her score, which I do not think they would have done. They didn't do it the first time if she were not going to be admitted. They said, we don't want to encourage young girls. And she wrote back to Pierre and Lucy. She said, it's kind of funny, but I'll take the exam again just to let them know that the young girls are not discouraged. Basically, she embarrassed them into admitting her by scoring 13th out of 400 candidates. And so she was admitted, but she had lost quite a bit of time because she'd been artificially prevented from entering the Ecole. She did get admitted in November of 1898, and she wrote to Pierre and Lucy, the judgment is in today only, and I am 13th. They take 40 in all. It is not much, but it's taken quite a little effort. I would not have gone on if it had not seemed like a sort of test in some way of work itself overcoming its natural difficulties. That made it seem a thing that really had to be won. Now, many Americans sat in on classes, few graduated, but when they did, it took them 6 years usually to go through the entire program. She had 3, because the one thing that was true for any student, no matter what your country of origin, was that when you turned 30, you had to leave. And she didn't get in until she was almost 28. So she had to finish work at half the amount of time, and she did it. You had to win. You got in these competitions. This was her final prize-winning entry. You either won, you accrued 1 or 2 points. That's as many as you got, and otherwise nobody had any points, and you had to get 26 points. But even though she made world history, first by being admitted as the first woman since 1648, and second by finishing the program, she wasn't listed in the great book about Americans at the Ecole des Beaux-Arts. The reason is she never got her diplôme. The diploma came after you did all of your 26 points and had a year's internship at an architect's office. And she didn't have that year because she'd been excluded. But she was never bitter about things like that, you know, and she just always found a way. What, to her acute dismay, she discovered when she returned to California in 1902 at the age of 30, was that she had become world famous. But right away, she began getting important commissions, and one of the early ones was to be construction superintendent at the University of California's Greek Theater. This was a gift, this building, from Phoebe Appers and her son, William Randolph Hearst, and it may be him in that central circle because he did speak on the day of the dedication. And that may be where Julia Morgan and William Randolph Hearst met. We're not exactly sure, but we do know they met through his mother. And he, in 1903, he was 40, and she, as I said, was in her early 30s. He was already a very dynamic newspaper publisher, a controversial political candidate, and an aspiring builder. He had asked Phoebe, who, as I said, held the purse strings, would it be all right if I built a small place south of Oakland? There was a little town called Hacienda where his father, George, had a horse ranch. Phoebe said, yes, just don't make it very large. This was the result. The Hacienda del Pozo de Verona, the house of the wellhead of Verona. And when Phoebe arrived to inspect it, 53 rooms in this building, she was so incensed, she confiscated it. He never spent a night in it. It became her house. And so she continued to hire the architect he had hired, Albert Schweinfurth, but sadly he died a very young man of typhoid, and then she hired Julia Morgan. Phoebe had met Julia in Paris and wanted to pay for her education. She had so many students she gave scholarships to, but Julia said, your confidence is enough of a gift. Turned that down, you know. But anyway, we do know that it was through his mother that these two remarkable people met. Another very important early commission was this El Campanile, the bell tower for women at the Mills College for Women in Oakland, a brand new building in the latest style Mission Revival, built between 1902 and 1904 out of steel reinforced concrete. Quite notable. It held the 10 bells that were from the Chicago World's Fair, and it became much more notable in 1906 because it survived the 1906 earthquake without a single crack in it. Steel reinforced concrete, 72 feet high, no structural damage. And it's probably the reason why Julia Morgan got her next important commission, which was to re-engineer the Fairmont Hotel on Nob Hill. It was a brand new building just weeks from opening, and not only was it gutted by fire, as you can see, but also its footings, the foundations had moved 7 feet. And many people weren't even sure if it was salvageable. Julia was not designing it, she was engineering it, and she talked about working in a little shack outside. It may be these little buildings that you see in the center of the photograph, working at night on the engineering calculations while rats jumped over her feet because the building was too unstable for her to move her office in until she had basically secured it. So this was her first major work, and it was done on the 1-year anniversary of the quake, on time, under budget, first major building back, and a tremendous uplift for a beleaguered city of San Francisco. So she had a lot of work from the beginning. She seldom advertised, and a lot of people, of course, moved to the East Bay where the weather was better, the lots were bigger, and the utilities were working. So she did a lot of buildings that we talk about today as the First Bay tradition, kind of these shingle houses in that Berkeley crafts style. The one on the left was actually a building that she gave to one of her longtime employees. He worked for her almost his whole career. So did his son and daughter. He and his wife named their first daughter Julia. His name was Thaddeus Joy, and she sold the building to him for $1 after his house was destroyed in a Berkeley fire in 1923. So he's extremely generous to her employees. This is a different building, but from the same era, that post-quake era in Berkeley. So you see the arts and crafts style with the built-in furniture and this beautiful relationship between the inside and the outside, as well as a lot of arts and crafts tile. She didn't just build small bungalows, though, and she was always known for respecting her clients and building what they wanted. And she really got a lot of criticism for this in the 1980s. When I first came to San Simeon, I came as a tourist in 1978, and I was told, a woman built this, but we don't know anything about her. She was that unknown. But in the early 80s, an assiduous woman named Sarah Boutelle, who became a great friend of mine, did a book. It was a book on the buildings of Julia Morgan, not her life. But anyway, then people started saying, well, she didn't have a style. She was a client's architect. Like listening to the client is a bad thing, Anyway, one of her clients, Mr. Lombard, in Piedmont, which was between Berkeley and Oakland up in the hills, had this watercolor that he had purchased, and he asked her if she would build a house that matched it. So she would do whatever you wanted her to do. There was a man who didn't like right angles, and she built a house that didn't have any. There was another man in Northern California who didn't like to get out of bed in the morning to turn the heat on, so she built a contraption that he could operate from under the covers. So whatever it was that you wanted, she would do. And not only that, but she honored everyone, and every building was as important to her. And one of the biggest arts and crafts compounds in the country is her work at what's called Asilomar. It's in Pacific Grove, which is very near Monterey, and this was a summer camp for the YWCA women. It means refuge by the sea. And these young women worked all year long, you know, and so this was where they would go for a 10-day journey in the summer. Julia designed 13 buildings there from 1913 to 1928. You can still stay there, and they're all lovely arts and crafts buildings made of the native materials. This is the chapel. I just showed you outside. Here's the inside, the Grace Dodge Chapel. You see at the back, they also used it as a theater, but at the back, instead of an altar, there's a window because it's right on the ocean. YWCAs were hugely important when young girls left their family farms and began to go to cities and work and had nowhere safe to live and didn't want to be in hotels with transient traveling salesmen, you know. So YWCAs were places where they could live economically and learn and grow and have friendships. But when Julia was designing the YWCA, which she designed dozens of them, usually just for cost, it was also a place where you felt better just being there because she always honored you no matter how humble the purpose of the building. What I don't think her clients knew was that in 1913, when she designed that Grace Dodge Chapel, Julia's youngest brother, who was the most successful of the young Morgan males, all of them lived at home. Even Julia's sister, after she married, they all lived at home. And Sam was young, and he had always wanted to be a fireman, and he was being driven because he'd been just promoted to captain, and he was driven to a fire, and his subordinate turned in front of a streetcar. And Sam was ejected and horribly injured, but because he was young and strong, he lingered for a terrible 6 months before dying. And it was an absolutely heartbreaking situation, and you know, she never spoke about it, but nevertheless, you know, her mother had a stroke, her father had a stroke. She did more and more to take care of them. I'm sure William Randolph Hearst didn't know. He hired her between 1913 and 1915, same time that I just showed of the chapel I just showed you, to build his headquarters, a newspaper printing plant and office building in downtown Los Angeles, the Los Angeles Examiner building, known today as the Herald Examiner building, and just beautifully restored just last year. 100,000 square feet, a paper news printing plant. So from the very beginning, he began to hire her as soon as he could. He was in a bit, as I said, of a stretched position economically. So he hired her to design him a grand house in Sausalito, which was never built, a big country house. But he did design, she did design for him a bungalow on the south rim of the Grand Canyon, as well as this and a few other structures. I'm sure that he didn't know, though, that just 5 years after that, as a matter of fact, every 5 years, from 1913 until the end of Julia's life, which came in 1957, something terrible happened, either to her or to her family. Her oldest brother, named Parmalee, that was her mother's surname, Parmalee, he was 2 years older than Julia, died, and we couldn't find his death certificate. My research assistant is so brilliant, and she finally found it, and we realized why, and that is that the surgeon, it had been misfiled, probably deliberately, but the surgeon listed on the right cerebrospinal lose as his cause of death, Parm's cause of death. That's syphilis, neurosyphilis, the worst, most debilitating disease that kills you by degrees and is also deeply scandalous. Parm had a wife, he had three other living siblings, and both of his parents. But at the bottom on the left, the person who signed the death certificate was Julia Morgan. And I couldn't figure out why she was in Pasadena so much. But that's where he was for years, in a sanitarium. She built a YWCA down there, but not till 1923. He died in 1918. And so that, and after that, her father died of a stroke. Her brother, who was closest in age to her, Avery, had, sorry, I'm going to take one of these because I'm just fighting a little laryngitis. He came to Paris to study with her. His name was Avery. They were the closest of the siblings. He loved architecture. He loved music, as she did. So he was the one who cared for Charles, and after their father died, Avery had a complete breakdown, and it turned out that what he had was early onset Alzheimer's. And Julia basically cared for Avery for his entire life. While she could, she employed him as first a draftsman, and then when he couldn't do that anymore, her driver, her chauffeur. But he would wander as people do with dementia, and she would organize searches for him. So her whole life was spent in these deep family responsibilities. And then, as I said, she also had physical problems herself, and But she never talked about these things. And as I say, I'm sure that I didn't know about Parm, and I didn't know as much about Sam or Avery, and I'm sure William Randolph Hearst didn't know any of it. When Phoebe died, which was in 1919, California came to a halt because she had given $20 million to charity. She'd founded the PTA and started free kindergartens and the Save the Redwoods League and restored all the missions and built the University of California, all these grand philanthropies. But it meant that Hearst, at the age of 56, was inheriting the family fortune. And he'd been planning all his life. He walked into Julia Morgan's office in San Francisco and was overheard saying, "I'm tired of camping on the hill at San Simeon, Miss Morgan. I'm getting old for tents. Thinking of building a little something." And that was the opening line on a project she certainly could have said no to. She knew Hearst well enough to know that he was a very active client and very prone to changing his mind. She said, "He does suffer from a great changeableness of mind, excuse me. But he compensates by letting me change mine now and then." There are 10,000 drawings that they exchanged, often with writing all over them, as well as 2,462 letters and telegrams. That's just the Hearst material of that we transcribed in our making available. He has said here at the top that he wants the archway on one of these cottages, the one on the right, which was his, excuse me, to be moved to the center, to be used as a guest house. I'm so sorry. This is what I was afraid would happen, but that's what water's for. So she did that. First, here's the drawing. They started with these 3 cottages. He'd said 6 months. We'll be done in 6 months. This is the House of the Sun, named for its view of the sunset, and there it is. These houses, these 3 cottages, which began the construction, have a total of 50 rooms. And as you see, they're terraced down the hillside. They're steel reinforced concrete. They're named for the view, and as Hearst said in one of the earliest letters, "Dear Miss Morgan, the main thing at the ranch is the view." He'd been coming to San Simeon all his life. He was 2 years old in 1865 when George Hearst bought this property, which eventually totaled more than 250,000 acres. It was a cattle ranch then. It's a cattle ranch now, still run by the Hearst family, with spectacular views of the coastline and the mountains. The nearest train station is 45 miles south, but there's a deep bay, a deep water port, a harbor below. This is what it looks like today. And so you can see it's in the middle of nowhere, and that there are hills much higher. At 3,100 feet, there are mountain springs that supply all of the gravity-fed water for the water supply, and even ran the hydroelectric plant in the early years of construction in the 1920s. The layout is one main building in the center, like a church on a high hill of a Mediterranean city. And then the 3 cottages, named for the views of the mountains, the sunset, and the sea in front. To the right, you can see the oval blue building. That's one of these swimming pools, the Neptune pool. At the back is a series of garages, but then also tennis courts, and underneath them is a second swimming pool. He called it La Cuesta Encantada, the Enchanted Hill. And it's 110,000 square feet of enclosed floor space. And we know about the first time that she took a trip there. There was nothing on that hilltop except for tents that would be erected on these platforms that they kept up year-round. And fortunately, the taxi driver kept a note of this. Julia came down from San Francisco all night, and that's usually how she would arrive, by train. As a matter of fact, she made 568 train trips, 8 hours each way, to San Simeon over those 28 years. But anyway, Hearst was waiting for her at the bottom of the hill, and at the train station, and they drove to San Simeon, which took 2 hours to go those 45 miles. Literally, the road ended, and there were 2 saddled horses. And she looked at him. She said, "I'm 47. I don't ride. That's not changing." And this is typically what she wore, which were beautifully hand-tailored white silk blouses made for her in Paris, and long tweed jackets, often with big pockets, or she'd wear a wrist purse, and then very, very long skirts. And when she climbed scaffolding, which she did all the time, she would wear men's trousers. underneath to preserve her modesty. She's working here on, it's a hot day, she's rolled up her sleeves. But anyway, she's not getting on a horse. Now, Hearst was practically born on a horse. So what they did that first time, which was like April, mid-April of 1919, she got in the back of the seat of the taxi. Hearst got on one of the horses. They called 2 cowboys from the ranch over. The taxi driver gunned the engine and drove it from sea level straight up 1,600 feet, missing the largest of these enormous rock outcroppings on the way. And the cowboys rode on either side and roped the bumper over the tough parts. So she did not need to say yes to this project. It was the middle of nowhere. She was the national architect for all of the YWCA projects at that point. She had more work than she could possibly do. But she and Hearst had a remarkable relationship. They really understood each other, and it was an extraordinary collaboration. It would be extraordinary today, a platonic collaboration of 28 years. But back in 1919, it was absolutely unprecedented. One of her staff members said, when those two bent over a drawing, the rest of us could have been 100 miles away. You could see the spark go from one to the other of their foreheads. And I can never go back to San Simeon without feeling it's haunted by their great personalities. Well, together they were able to do things that neither one of them did apart. She was able, there were other women architects in America. It was a small coterie, but there were many. And but they built houses and women's clubs and kitchen remodels. She did all that. But she also did buildings on a scale that are almost unequaled in our country's history, because she worked for Hearst. And he knew that she would not steer him wrong. She listened to him, she believed in him, but she could always steer the question, As a matter of fact, he had a lot of women working for him in many high positions in all of his fields of journalism. And one of them was a woman reporter named Adela Rogers St. John. She said, Miss Morgan could say nothing in more ways than my great Aunt Betsy. The signal. Well, yes, we could add that wing, Mr. Hearst, but then the view of the ocean would be remote, that sort of thing. So they really trusted each other. It's all steel reinforced concrete. Its inspiration was a church, a specific cathedral, Santa Maria la Mayor in Andalusia in Spain. They faced the concrete with a white manti limestone from Utah. The letters say things like Mr. Hearst saying, Miss Morgan, let's have the tile of the Casa Grande. That's what they called the big house. He called the whole place the ranch. Formal name, the Enchanted Hill, La Cuesta Encantada, but usually they just called it the ranch. He said, let's have the tiles be a color blue that matches the blue of the sky. He wasn't there all the time. She wasn't there all the time. And that's why, she'd come down 2 times a month and try to meet her on Sundays. But that's why we have this incredible archive of work. But her work was continuing while all that was happening. Avery was having his breakdown. And in 1925, when the main building looked, the first 3 floors of it were ready, and the cottages were all done, Avery, as I said, had a breakdown. Her father had died. Her mother, Eliza, had dementia and strokes. And she didn't want to leave the house in Oakland. But Oakland, that neighborhood which had been around the corner from the mayor, was not a good neighborhood anymore. Eliza didn't want anything to change. So what they did, they kept the house. Avery had to be institutionalized. And Julia bought the Victorian on the left, took the top floor off it, made it her little pied-à-terre. Ended up eventually living there, but she used it just kind of as a way station in San Francisco because her office was in San Francisco. She eventually bought the one next door and then rented that out to often the female staff in her office. But for Eliza, who didn't want anything to change, Julia's younger sister Emma and her husband Hart owned a house in Berkeley that Julia had designed for them. They had a vacant lot next door where Julia built this house. And one Sunday, they had Mrs. Morgan over for dinner. And after dinner, they walked her to the house. The downstairs was an apartment for a nurse. But upstairs was Eliza's bedroom with all the furniture exactly where it belonged and a fire in the fireplace. And she never knew she'd moved. And it's an indicator of how she felt about architecture, the importance of architecture. It's not just turning on the heat while you're under the covers, It's that feeling of safety. We're all surrounded by architecture all of our lives, and she understood the psychology and delight and comfort of shelter for everyone. So she's still working for Hearst, who's the kind of enthusiastic collector like we would say Marjorie Merriweather Post, and he's buying in this abundant way, but not before he began to build. It's after San Simeon is underway that he starts to acquire things. Less than 5% of what is there was in his collection prior. So nothing, all these things are arriving, and nothing's the right size, for where it's going to go. And like Marjorie Merriweather Post, took advantage of an incredible opportunity to acquire elegant collections because of cultural situations in Russia, that she was privy to because of being married to Joseph Davies. Well, Hearst was doing the same thing. It's between the First and Second World War was the time when Americans were buying art from Europe, especially Southern Europe. And he went to Europe a lot, but that's not where he bought. He bought in New York City. Matter of fact, he bought from Mitchell Samuels of French and Company, where Marjorie Merriweather Post did a lot of buying. And also a lot of auctions as well. The ceiling, was a series of panels. It wasn't a ceiling. A series of carved wooden panels. It's bolted to steel I-beams. It's not structural. None of the 40 antique ceilings in San Simeon are structural, and some of them weren't even previously ceilings. The choir stalls, these seats against the wall, they'd come from a cathedral in southern Spain, in Seu de Urgel, a cathedral that had been built in the 11th century. The choir stalls were added in the 14th century. They were removed in the 20th century as part of a restoration. And Hearst bought them all, and they used them as wainscoting. Hearst was a great admirer of Stanford White, and probably would have hired him if he'd had any money. But of course, Stanford White was shot, tragically killed in 1906. And there was a huge sale, and this ceiling, which is in one of the sitting rooms of one of the main house of a guest suite called the Doge's Suite, Stanford White had that ceiling in his Gramercy apartment in New York City. It's Vaudevilles, angels announcing the tidings of Christ's birth, surrounded by these little lozenges showing the virtues. So part 17th century, part 18th century, even though Hearst owned it, one of the few things he owned prior to construction, Julia's added an extra border. They have these people they call the wormers, who are drilling holes in the new wood to match the old wood. Not for a feeling of deception. The goal isn't authenticity. The goal is effect. Stanford White said, we're the new Rome. And like any conquering country, we take the art of Europe, we improve on it. And how do we do that? By bringing it together. And of course, the other way, really, I think probably the most important way, that Hearst and Marjorie Merriweather Post were like souls, is that they both adored the decorative arts. When, honestly, fine art, as in paintings and statues, were much more the thing for American collectors to acquire. And he had two libraries, just as Hillwood has two libraries. This one has 4,500 books, and on the second story. But it also has this fabulous collection of his Greek vases. He had 450 ancient Greek vases, between 2,200 and 2,700 years of age. And his 5 great collections were elements of architecture, pottery, and particularly Greek vases, textiles of every type, especially tapestries, mostly Renaissance, and Persian carpets, Renaissance furniture, and silver. Those are the 5 great categories. But he's buying everything, and matter of fact, to one art dealer Julia wrote in Spain, she said, now I know this sounds awful, but it's not, because it's such a huge and highly personal connection between pre-existing objects. She's having to think of the scale, and the gardens go up at the same time. And that's another area where I'm so thrilled to be able to talk as part of your garden series. They've got to haul in the topsoil. They've got to haul in the fully grown trees. I'd say that the letters, and I've written an entire book about San Simeon's gardens published by Abrams, I'd say that the letters are more than half about the gardens, because he knew that was the immediate permanence. And here's a drawing that Julia did that of 2 people who look a lot like William Randolph Hearst, and maybe herself, though she's given herself a few inches. She was actually about 5'3". But they would spend so much time in the gardens and always thinking of the sight line and always thinking of the view. He owned this view. He owned all of those mountains. So it's the Coast Range, the Santa Lucias, that runs right along the coastline on the edge of the western edge of the continent. And you see what grows. It's oaks, and they grow in the crevices where the water flows, and on the north-facing slopes that stay cool the longest. So everything that isn't an oak tree had to come up that hill, including the cypress trees and the Washingtonia foliifera, the fan palms, as well as the topsoil, and he adored roses. And I think that's another way in which Hillwood and San Simeon have a great affinity. They took this is the Cecile Brunet, they took the roses and grew them up the fan palms. They also planted annuals every season, 4 times a year, and had the parterres. And so you don't walk to the gardens. The gardens are intrinsic. They surround the cottages. And there's a ribbon. The esplanade is a walkway that encircles the main building and connects all of the structures together. But Hearst landscape had a very wide definition, which included the largest private zoo in America. Julia built these open shelters, like Adirondack kind of style shelters, on the road because, they gave these animals 2,000 acres. They just, oh, wow. That was a graphic illustration. They just headed for the hills, right? So the water buffalo and the gazelles and the llamas and things, they would be grazing as the guests would drive up the 6-mile. She had to build a road, right? She had 6 miles from the bottom of the hill to the top. Now, Marianne, the elephant, had her own quarters. The bottom of the hill, there are warehouses, 5 of them, including one that Julia designed to look like a mission. And there's an estate village, which is still used for that purpose today. The beautiful Spanish-style buildings that Julia designed are now used by the cow boss, and the ranch managers and people. Some of these ranches had been born on the Hearst Ranch, so it's still definitely in use. But probably the most memorable aspect of the landscape were Julia's swimming pools, and these 2 extraordinary pools. I think this is where, she was able to access these sensual parts of herself that, working with Hearst, that she really wasn't able to indulge on other projects. They understood architecture. The inspiration for what they call the Roman plunge, this indoor pool, was Galla Placidia, a 5th century mausoleum built in Ravenna with gorgeous mosaics of lapis blue glass and bright golden stars. Now that's on the ceiling at Galla Placidia. Here it's on the floor. And as a matter of fact, those golden stars, which are 22 karat gold with glass above and below, so sandwiched in between clear glass, they're the lane markers for lap swimming in this pool. Behind the walls are 2 staircases that lead to that platform dive. And can you see the Art Deco nymphs that are diving off it? It's part Ravenna, it's part Hollywood, It really has this wonderful, it was built from 1930 to 34, and it's all done in this Venetian mosaic glass, but it was laid out in San Francisco and then glued into sheets, and with this extraordinary effect, 205,000 gallons of that gravity-fed water I mentioned before. And it looks like a shining mirror. And if you haven't seen it at night, you simply must. They do show it at night in the spring and the fall when these alabaster lamps glow like dozens of moons above and below on the water. And that would be memorable enough. But, of course, San Simeon has 2 pools, not one. And this is the big one, the Neptune pool, as it was known, for the namesake figure, a 17th century fountain sculpture, which they, in the top of the pediment there, with 2 sea nymphs, they've mounted it in concrete, so it looks like a relief in a pediment, but it's a freestanding statue. And then the columns are 2,000 years old. They're ancient Roman. The 2 on the outer edges are much shorter than the other 4. He's reading Edith Wharton's book on Italian gardens. He's reading Charles Adams Platt, and so is Julia Morgan. They're getting ideas and motifs, but then there always are the modern touches, like Charles-Georges Cassou, who did the wonderful nymphs embracing swans, these nymphs with their page boy hairstyles. And nighttime, it has another aspect, and this is the original lighting that Julia designed. Charles Moore called this pool a grand liquid ballroom. And indeed, it was for the stars, the gods and goddesses, but the ones you saw on the silver screen. And that was because he lived with Marion Davies, the film actress. And she was a beloved comedian. He married in 1903 when he was 40 and his wife Millicent was 20, and they had 5 sons. But Millicent was a society woman. She didn't like San Simeon. She was a Catholic. She wouldn't consent to a divorce. So Hearst lived with Marion openly from the mid-20s on. And she was, of course, the animating spirit at San Simeon, all her friends, the Hollywood folk who came. She was in 40 films. And her house in Santa Monica, which Julia Morgan also participated in constructing, one huge beach house. It's now the Wallace Annenberg Beach House. And then this Hollywood Regency-style guest house, which you can tour. And so it is sort of Georgian with a Hollywood flair that especially applies to this wonderful 1930s bathrooms. So Julia's doing all of this work while she's building San Simeon. She's like Marjorie Merriweather Post, Hearst has these far-flung and architecturally disparate buildings. He's got a castle in Great Britain. He's got a million-acre ranch in Mexico. He's got the beach house in Santa Monica. It's Marion's, but he's paying for it. He's got a 30-room apartment in New York City. He's got on the Gold Coast in Long Island a chateau, Alva Vanderbilt's Belmont's chateau, St. Joan. And Julia's working on some of those. She's also working, as I showed you that columbarium, the Chapel of the Chimes. She's working on that Berkeley City Club that I was mentioning. It was designed, in under a year. All steel reinforced concrete, but with this beautiful feeling of the past. Concrete beams that look like old stone, look like old wooden ceiling beams. She's designing the lampposts, the hanging lights, designing the bookcases, designing the book plates, designing the china, and designing the beautiful swimming pool, which makes up its first floor. And as far as programmatic architecture, the extraordinary thing she did for Hearst in 1930, when the wind tune I showed you, Phoebe's wind tune, burned to the ground, Hearst hired her to rebuild it in a totally different way, and it has 3 separate areas that altogether, if you put them together, are probably close to the size of San Simeon, but they're over a mile length of a rushing river on the border of Oregon and California. It's not open to the public, it's private. But one of the things Julia designed for WR, was this fabulous Bavarian village. This is Cinderella House, where the clock is a minute to midnight, and Cinderella is rushing down the staircases, and they're dancing with joy at the ball. This is Brown Bear, named for the Brothers Grimm story, Bearskin. And here at the front, these houses face each other, but their backsides are hanging over this wild and scenic river. Literally, you can fish off the edge of the balconies. So incredibly dramatic, and just as far away in another, middle of nowhere place, and she's working on all of that and San Simeon, and it was too much. And her health really began to suffer. You see her face has been disfigured. She'd always had ear infections. Eventually, her whole inner ear was removed. She lost her equilibrium, could no longer climb scaffolding, but she did it anyway. She asked one of her employees to walk in front. She put her finger in his pocket so she could walk behind and still climb up. But she fell many times and was always mistaken for being drunk because of the way she reeled around. She said architects should be symmetrical. She underwent many operations, was in a great deal of pain. And though WR would say, Miss Morgan, you must rest sometime. You can't race all the time. You wouldn't treat an engine the way you treat yourself. In the very next page of that letter, he'd say, I want this, I want this, I want this, right? And she wanted it too, and the great project that they worked on together and never finished, he bought 2 monasteries, 12th century Cistercian monasteries in Spain, one of which was being used as a wheat farm and the other as a brewery. But he gave all of the stones to the city of San Francisco, and they were going to build a West Coast cloisters in the 30s, and Julia designed it. Here's the exterior. It was going to have these fabulous limestone stones on its exterior, and the inside was all going to be Hearst's medieval art collection. So really, like what Rockefeller had done, a West Coast cloisters, to be located in Golden Gate Park between the Japanese Tea Garden and the old Dion Museum. But it was never built. The stones were carried away. There were 5 fires. The the wood cartons burned around them. The markings were removed. Only one small portion, the chapter house, enough stones have been salvaged that actually a Cistercian order in northeastern California, Our Lady of Clairvaux, has taken the chapter house. But it's a wonderful, might have been. Julia knew all too well when she herself started having memory problems what it meant. And finally, Avery wandered and never came back, and after 9 months, they found his body in a field. He had died of starvation and exposure. And so when she began to show signs of memory loss, it was a terrible blow. You see her there on the left, and she's with her family. Leaning over the young woman is the woman who was married to Julia's nephew, Morgan, the little boy you saw at the beginning. And she's the one who donated Julia's archive. And the young woman smiling in the back is Sachi Oka. This was a young person whom Julia met in Monterey. Julia bought a little halfway house in Monterey when her health was so poor she had to rest between San Francisco and San Simeon. She'd spend one night in Monterey on her way down. Sachi became first a housekeeper and then a devoted friend. Julia bought her a car when Sachi was 16. Julia didn't drive. When she and her husband Kazuo were deported to post in Arizona to an internment camp, Julia sent them money and things that they needed. When they got out, she called Sachi. She and Kazuo were going to go to Detroit hoping to get work in the auto industry. But Julia said, "I bought you a house in Monterey near mine if you come home." And Sachi lived in that house for the rest of her life. Julia knew that she'd be remembered for San Simeon, but she really was seldom remembered at all. And part of it was that Citizen Kane came out and, people thought, oh, well, this is San Simeon, Xanadu, and it's a dark and gloomy and horrible place. It came out in 1941. Also, she never taught architecture. She didn't write about it. She didn't teach it. She just wanted to do it, And she didn't like to be interviewed. She said her buildings would speak for her. But for a long time, they didn't speak. I told you that I got up there and was told that we knew nothing about her in the 70s. Well, in 1957, Life magazine had a big cover story because W.R. he died in 51. He wanted it to go to UC Berkeley. That's the big family philanthropy. They turned it down, too expensive. So a little bit like what happened here with the Smithsonian and hesitancy, Anyway, that's how it became a California state park. It was donated. The castle, all the contents were donated. And so it opened on the 2nd of June of 58. So again, in terms of timing, we're getting close with Hillwood here, 57. But Life magazine said, you're finally going to see San Simeon. 14-page article. Dozens of photographs, lots of text. Julia Morgan's name was never mentioned. In 1966, Joan Didion did an essay called A Return to Xanadu about going to San Simeon as a child, going as an adult. Julia Morgan's name was never mentioned. So there's a great deal of redressing to do, and I'm ending here with one photograph she didn't mind being taken because she was given an honorary doctorate by her alma mater, the University of California, in 1929. She said, America needs museums of architecture, not just paintings and statues. She said the enjoyment that we've had is nothing to the enjoyment people will have in the future. And W.R. said the same thing. He said, we're building for 1,000 years. He said, not everyone can go abroad. And it's very special to stand in a place like this and talk not just about two visionaries, William Randolph Hearst and Julia Morgan, but about a third visionary who's done so much for you in Washington, Marjorie Merriweather Post. Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Please leave if you need to. If someone has a question, I'll wait for the mic. Is it you, Carol Lee? Yes. Okay, what would you like to ask?
Thank you very much for your presentation and your enthusiasm for Hillwood. I visited the castle many years ago, and it was emphasized to me that the pool was impractical, that there weren't steps to get into it. It was beautiful, but not practical. And I always have thought of that when I think of how practical Marjorie Merriweather Post is. And you talked about some of their similarities. I was wondering if you see that contrast in some ways.
It's a good question. Was the pool practical, and do you see Julia Morgan as being practical? There actually were gorgeous marble curved staircases, but they look like they're so beautiful. There are 4 marble stairs to get into the pool. There also was an 8-foot dive, but we kept losing visitors off it. What do you know? So the diving board was removed. But Julia Morgan was really known for being practical. For instance, if you had a window box in your Berkeley house, then there'd be a spigot in it, so you didn't have to haul a hose up, that sort of thing. She was really definitely known known for that. We have someone here who actually lives in a Julia Morgan house. His parents still do. If there were a fireplace, she'd make windows on both sides of it. She said, well, sometimes you want to watch the fire and look outdoors. So it was always with those thoughts. And I think there was another question.
Thank you very much. First is a commonality, and I was wondering if you could comment on it. The name Davies, Marion Davies for Hearst, and Joseph
Davies, yeah.
Right, so if you had a comment on that, and then I want to tell you all about something else that a woman, without a woman's intervention would never have occurred, a movie that I'm sure all of you have seen. But I'll leave that until you respond.
Well, I'll be quick with your answer because Marion's actual name was Douras, Douras, and she used Davies as a stage name. She had sisters, older and younger, who were showgirls, and they had already picked that name, so there's no relation. But I did think about it, too. It's interesting. Now your story.
Yeah, the story is a movie you've all seen, I'm sure, Casablanca, which, of course, was set in 1941, and the woman who was responsible for it, probably none of you have heard her name. Her name was Rennie Lee, and she found Everyone Comes to Rick's. And it was her persistence, despite huge obstacles, that led to the movie being made and being what, for many of us, is one of the best films ever made. And that story is told in a great book called Season of the Gods that came out last October. So.
Well, thank you for the recommendation. I'll just say that Hearst always had, as I mentioned, women in high positions. His Washington Herald newspaper was run by Eleanor Sissy Medill Patterson, for instance. I told you his top reporters were women. His top screenwriters were women, including Frances Marion, great screenwriter in early Hollywood, and she won. Hearst produced 120 films, not just Marion Davies' films, but she won the Academy Award for a prison movie called The Big House. Someone else. Yes.
Hi, thank you so much for this incredibly enjoyable and informative talk. It was fantastic. I'm the lucky person who grew up in a Julia Morgan house in Berkeley, and my parents still live there. And my mom was telling me this afternoon when I was talking to her on the phone and telling her I was going to get to come to this lecture, she said that she had heard that Julia Morgan designed a building in Washington, D.C., that was never built. And my mom and I were wondering if you know anything about that.
I don't. It's possible, though. We do have job lists, but I got to tell you, I'm always finding out things. I spent November in Japan, and I was specifically there to research in Tokyo because the Tokyo YWCA, which is credited to a man, was designed by Julia Morgan. And I'm going to be, I saw her drawings, and I'm going to be writing about that. So she's constantly surprising us. Now, I do know that Phoebe lived in a fabulous estate in Washington, D.C., Phoebe Apperson Hearst, when George was the senator. I don't know if that is why. She also designed a place for a doctor in New Zealand, so I won't say it's impossible. But generally speaking, Julia built in the West. She built nothing really much further than Salt Lake City. And now it turns out she built in the real West, as far west as Tokyo. She built the Tokyo Y in 1927. But nobody knows it yet, including me until November. Anyone else? Yes?
Yes, thank you so much for a fabulous lecture and photos. I was wondering, toward the end of her life, you said she was having memory issues. Did she have to retire? Did she have to have care? Did she have Alzheimer's? Do we know more about that?
Yeah, the question was asked about her memory issues. Did she have to retire? Did she have to have care? She did. She knew she would go to a job site and she would have forgotten all the numbers that she'd written down. And she was very, very frustrated. So she started to travel. And W.R. had his own problems. They weren't health problems, they were financial. He went into such a spending spree in the 1920s that he overspent. He never was wealthier than number 37 on the list of American millionaires, and that was in the that was the zenith, But by the late 1930s, by 1937, he was $87 million in debt. And he hadn't wanted to lay off staff. He employed 38,000 people across the country. He certainly never wanted to stop buying art or building things. And his son, Bill Jr., said, well, Pop never really did understand money. not as a quantifiable and, a perishing thing. But anyway, when Julia was no longer able to work for WR, then she started to travel, and her family said she only traveled when she couldn't build. She took freighters, and she caught them kind of like buses. She'd take a fruit boat to Sicily or something, and you would there'd be 12 people on the boat. She could sleep in the same stateroom every night. And it was for a woman of a certain age, late 60s, 70s, it was a good way to travel. But eventually, she got left behind. Forgot how to get back to the ship. And then she came home and booked a round-the-world cruise. It left from San Francisco, and she figured she'd never have to get off the boat. So she never gave up anything. And I'll end by saying that if you have more questions, I'd be delighted to answer them out there. I'm going to be signing books, but also if you just have a question, stand in line. I'll say one thing, and that is that this has been a great pleasure. And this 800,000-word archive, which we're, getting all digitally correct so it can be posted, is word searchable. That's why we're doing it. But that means that you can look for what's there and you can look for what's not there. And there are two words that hardly ever appear, and they are can't and cannot. Thank you very much.